We're continuing on in 05 events, and what I'd like to do is just show you, we've seen this example show post HTML, we've seen this example in the demo app, and we're just going to have a look at it because it's going to show how the changing the props can then go and make an API request and redisplay it. So this is the page here. What it's doing is it's going off to get a particular post, but we can also, it's post ID 88, we can change it and it renders to 83. And if we have a look in here, we can see all of that going through. I've done some console logs of different things going on. Attribute has changed and it's re-rendering. If we go into elements, main to output, we can see in our component we've got the post ID 83 here. If we change that back to 88 and render it, we can see that's how it's happening. So if we have a look at our component now, because now we're kind of developing some useful things, we're going into our show post, standard constructor, style card, component output will go into this div ID here called div ID info. So it'll be actually displayed within the component. We're observing, listening for the post ID attribute. We've just seen that changed. We have our attribute change callback, and instead of name here, we can basically use attribute, but that's the name of the attribute. And so what we're doing is we're sort of saying if the old value equals the new value for post ID, for example, if any time the old value just equals the new value, we don't want to do anything, so we return. However, if there is a change, and in this example the name is the post ID, what we're doing is we're getting the new value, which was 83 or 88, setting it to a property on the component for reference, and then re-rendering the get post. So that's how the property attribute change is working. If we look at the lifecycle events, we've got our connected callback, which we're not really using at the moment. And we also have another lifecycle event called disconnected callback for any cleanup, for event listeners, etc. So these are the two main lifecycle events. But we have our internal function that is actually, although it's designated as underscore get post to indicate it's private, as we've seen in previous lessons, it can still be accessed from the outside. It's not actually private, but we're just kind of declaring it as a kind of private method in the component. We're doing a fetch request. We're getting the post ID that's passed in. Get post, passing in the ID. The new value comes in here, comes down here. Plain old fetch request, res.json, getting the output, getting an access to the shadow DOM. So basically here when we're selecting the info, which was up top here in our HTML, the info tag, we're then displaying it here. And for example, this is a public method here. We could open this up. This would be available. This public method is no different to the private method in terms of accessibility, but we're just indicating that it's private. So if we come back here, we can now see when we refresh the page, go into console, there we can see it's gone to get ID 88, and I'm just displaying out the post data, looping through it. We can see connected callback fired, we can see the lifecycle events. The post ID was initially null, then when the page was rendered it changed to 88, but we don't want to make calls or do different things when it changes, when it initially starts, so we wait till there's actually a change in the value, so to 88, render it. We're going off to this URL, and we can have an event handler that basically is just changing. If we look in here, we refresh the page, we can see 88 here, change it to 83, there it's changed, and we've designated a re-render. We can also make things like arrange. These are just different examples of the same things, and you begin to see how it's a very straightforward boilerplate. Here we're going to get a range of posts. So let's actually see this in action. Here we have a range of posts that we're listing. Everything in here is inside the web component. And we want to change the range from 10 to 30. Sorry, this in case this is 30 to 40. I must have made a little change in that. If we come back in here, yeah, we're changing from 30 to 50. What we can do on that button is change it. We've got our component, show all posts in a range. We add an event listener, so when we click, we can then change the range here. And you may notice, well, why am I stringify? Why don't I have a min and max on my component? I just found that if you have separate attributes, the web component will re-render on each of them. And if you're making network requests, basically you don't want to duplicate them. So you only want one attribute to be changing, but it can contain all the data. So if we come back here, we can look, we've got our expectation, we've got a button to change the range with ID button changed. Get access to it on that button. When we click it, we're getting access to our web component. Remember, as we spoke before, it's as if the HTML tag of show all post, it's almost like it's creating a new instance. So it's saying this here on the page is create a new instance of that component class that gets rendered, but also I now have access to different things in here. When we do that, we set the attribute range to string range. Now that attribute doesn't actually exist on here, but we can set the attribute and set its property here. Or if we had properties on it originally, which we'll see in future examples, we can change that, which we saw in the previous example where we just set the ID property. We can change that, and that then works. So coming back here, we refresh, set range 10 to 31, and what I'm going to do here is change that button from 30 to 50 so it's consistent. Come back, if we look at the console, refresh the page, and what I'm doing is I'm just displaying data. Now you see what it gets back is an object min max 30 50 that it can deconstruct. If we had min tags and max tags, if you change one, you might get two renders. So I prefer to put it in a stringified there, and we're just outputting some data for us. So that's the example of show all posts, and we're going to see more examples of how we're using it, but basically it's still the same: props down, events up. This is an example that contains a lot more JavaScript within them, and we can see that some components can get large. This is a hover. Let's just change this one and open it up. Go into F12. It's a tooltip icon, which actually probably works better there. If you go into F12, into the elements, that's the text that we're displaying here. I'll change that here. There we see it. Because of the F12 being open, the dev tools, I need to click rather than do mouse over. That's just another example. So now what we've basically done, we've looked at some different examples. We're going to move now into kind of seeing how some design patterns of child to parent and siblings communicating with one another via a parent. So we'll do that in the next video.